This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
And I'm Desmond Ferris.
This is our final episode in the series, and we are wrapping it up this season with a look at the future of the industry. So we're addressing some other issues we didn't get to along the way, and we're just going to give sort of our final thoughts. And there are just so many topics that we didn't get to because this topic is so large and unwieldy. Most of the time, it's why we had to explain what we even meant when we said private military contractors.
Right. The deeper we dove, the actual more we found out was actually involved in this community and this career field as a private military contractor.
What was really cool about exploring this topic is that when we went into it, we found out that there were so many other layers to it. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about it is that it's conflated to mean so many different things. We have people in Western businesses doing logistics, people working in food halls and IT, and then we have security teams in the field. And then to complicate it even further, we have actual mercenary type fighters in places like Russia. And it's complicating what we mean when we say private military contracting.
When talking about Western PMC companies, wasn't there one question that kept coming up?
Yes. So this question of cost effectiveness kept on coming up because it's one of those key questions in contracting. Is it worth it? Is this something that the military is actually saving their money on? And so what was interesting about it as well is that no one could agree on it. So this was addressed in our very first episode with David Eisenberg, who is a journalist who's been looking at this industry for much of his career. And I really loved his response to this question.
Well, it's like the question of beauty. I mean, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so is cost effectiveness. It really comes down to what do you consider to be a benefit and what do you consider to be a cost? And people count those in different ways. When that day comes, when everybody has agreed what is a cost and benefit, they've all agreed to count the exact basket of cost and benefits for, equivalent private and public sector units, then maybe we'll have an answer. Hasn't happened yet. I look forward to the day when it does. I don't expect to be alive, though.
And of course, this is not something that everyone agrees to. We brought this answer to Doug Brooks, who's an expert, and he's really helped shape the industry by creating the International Stability Operations Association. And this is what he said in response to David Eisenberg.
Look, you hire these companies because they're faster, better, or cheaper, or some combination of those. In many cases, all three. The private sector is a lot more nimble than militaries or than governments. And that's a capability that governments can tap into and hire and so on. If a company is not cost effective, why would you hire them? I argue that 99.9% of the time, it's always going to be cheaper using a contractor. It's not always what you want to do for a lot of reasons, but it's always going to be cheaper.
So we wanted to have sort of a final thought on this question of cost effectiveness. So we brought in Steve Schooner, who is a professor of government procurement law, and he's a former Army Reserve officer and was the associate administrator for procurement law and legislation at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the Office of Management and Budget, which is a mouthful. But it's all to say that he's thought about this question a lot. So we asked him about this cost-effective question, which is run throughout the series.
So it's really an interesting question. A lot of people have talked about this, and there have been some empirical studies, but they're not really good. At the end of the day, I do not believe there's any empirical evidence that outsourcing is inherently cheaper or more expensive. And part of the problem is it's apples to oranges. And I think the best example I could give you of that is the log cap contract, which was popularized during Iraq and Afghanistan. A generation from now, we may look back at Iraq and Afghanistan, and military historians may say that the single most significant advance in military history was not drones and it wasn't cyber, but it was the outsourcing. It was the literal ability of the government to turn to a contractor and say, look, I need somebody to support me wherever I fight in the world. I can't tell you in advance where, what the weather's going to be, what the threat condition's going to be. But today, the United States military can project and sustain lethality around the world more effectively than any nation ever has in the history of the world. It's expensive. And as you know, many commanders were complaining that their troops were coming home overweight or they were spending too much time in the gym because the food was too good. But at the end of the day, we are paying a price premium for surge capacity and flexibility and a quality of support for the troops that no military has ever had before. So you can't compare that to the military that I grew up in, where boys in green basically did the cooking and the laundry and the mail service. It's apples and oranges.
So we're going to continue with Steve because one of his areas of focus is contractor fatalities, which is another form of cost when you really think about it. It's something we've touched on, but certainly deserves a little bit more discussion. Let's hear what he had to say.
I think this is one of the most significant issues today with regard to contractors, and I think it's an issue that's evolved outside of the public's consciousness, and I think that's really a bad thing. The reality is that as we've outsourced and the government has become more reliant on contractors, particularly the military today can't move, fight, communicate, or sustain without a fully integrated contractor presence. But what the public isn't aware is we've also outsourced sacrifice. And one of the most interesting studies I've seen is a study by Rand a number of years ago that talks about the issue of casualty sensitivity. And what Rand demonstrated, and the public doesn't really appreciate, and the media surely doesn't appreciate, is that the public really doesn't care what war costs. They really only want to know two things. Are we winning or losing? And how many of our boys or girls are coming home in bags and boxes? That's what the public cares about. So against that backdrop, as we have outsourced sacrifice, the public has no idea what the human cost of our military efforts abroad are. For a number of years in Iraq and Afghanistan, more contractors were dying every year than boys and girls in uniform, and the public doesn't realize it. Now, forget this administration, but even the Obama administration refused to use the word contractor on Memorial Day and generally did not want to acknowledge this. Now, I'm not saying it's intentional, but the government, in effect, gets a more flexible public reaction in terms of casualty sensitivity because we've dramatically reduced the number of men and women in uniform who are dying and being injured in combat, and that brunt is being borne by contractors. Now, before I go too far afield, it's worse than that. It's not just that more contractors are dying, but the injury issue is horrific. If you have a member of the military in uniform standing next to a contractor and they both lose a leg to an IED, the member of the military will come home to the military hospital system and spend the rest of his or her life being cared for by the VA medical system. The contractor is going to be left on the tarmac, and the government has achieved one of the great economic bargains of the modern marketplace.
This leads us into another form of cost effectiveness, which is third country nationals. These are all the workers who aren't U.S. citizens but are working for the U.S. companies or the U.S. cause in one way or another. And in some cases, these workers are the majority.
And just to put this workforce into perspective, just last year in 2018, over half of the DoD contractor personnel in Iraq and Syria were either these third country or host country nationals.
And when Steve made his report on contractor casualties public, he struggled with the response he received on these non-U.S. deaths.
The pushback I got, because people only cared about Americans, was flabbergasting. I mean, there are people who honestly don't care about people who aren't American dying or being injured supporting the Americans. So they don't care if they're allies, but I mean, it's just a remarkable thing. It seems to me that if we rely on people to perform our missions, they're us. That's our team. And we have to kind of get to that. The reality is the military was always highly integrated. Anybody who's been in the military in the modern era knows that we are fully integrated with our allies. We are international. We are multicultural. We have, I think, in many ways, we're moving in the right directions on gender and related issues. But I do think that we've seen exactly how incendiary some of those issues are, and I think that makes all this more complicated.
Matthew Lowe runs the blog Feral Jundy, an insider's account of the industry and a place for the community to come together. He's a former Marine infantryman and current security contractor. He dedicates a portion of the blog to contractor casualties.
We've reached over 4,000 deaths, contractor deaths, in these wars since 9/11. That's 4,000 people. They have friends, family, loved ones. I'll say this too. Department of Labor, they only mention the 4,000 contractors that are killed. Of those 4,000, I'd say most of them were interpreters that were killed. These are Iraqi and Afghan contract interpreters who worked for the troops out in the field, who were absolutely essential to connecting with the local populations. And these interpreters risked a lot, and they got killed, they got wounded, and that's a huge portion of the deaths. But the other thing I want to mention too, because of the international aspect of contracting, is the deaths not mentioned. I would put the number probably several thousand more that were killed just because they don't fall under the auspice of a Defense-Based Act. They're contractors that, let's say, work for the Canadian Embassy or whatnot, so they don't fall under that kind of reporting scheme. So even the DBA report, that's great for as far as registering contracts that fall under DBA, but everything else that has been involved with this war, as far as deaths and injuries, I have no idea. I don't know how many we got out there, but I speculate it's a lot more than what we're seeing just with those numbers.
When we come back, the role of contracting in America's intelligence, advice from current security contractors, and more. Hello, it's me, Desmond Ferris. You know me as the current co-host of Force for Hire. I want to introduce you to the next podcast by Stars and Stripes titled Military Matters. I will be coming back to you with a new co-host, Army Reserve Warrant Officer Rod Rodriguez, and we will discuss topical issues, interesting military-related stories, and events. You'll want to tune in for a unique perspective brought to you by an Air Force veteran, myself, and a soldier who is still serving. Together, we'll focus on topics that matter most to you, the worldwide military community. Look for the Military Matters podcast later this fall. Can't wait for you to listen.
One thing we didn't get to in our series, which I think really deserves some time, is just how much contracting is used in the DoD's intelligence. So we met up with Tim Sharrock, who's a journalist and author of Spies for Hire. He's been researching this topic for a while, and here's what he learned.
So there was a sort of, network of contracting companies in intelligence that had already been set up in the late 1990s. And, of course, everything changed after 2001 and 9/11 and the attacks on New York and Washington. And suddenly, over the next, 2 years, intelligence budgets increased drastically. Huge amounts of money were poured into the intelligence apparatus overall. And, of course, defense budgets went up as well. And that's when these agencies, rather than, again, building up their own agencies, they went to the private sector and hired contractors for some immediate needs. We know the NSA really expanded its capabilities, and a lot of that was being done, by contractors by that time. So there was kind of an explosion of the use of contractors after 9/11, and it steadily increased, throughout the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
So this was a reaction to a crisis, and then it became a trend.
It became a trend, yeah. Rather than train cadres of government employees to do this work, a lot of agencies thought, well, I guess they weren't thinking that long term, and they thought, well, they had this immediate need to take care of, and so they brought in contractors. But it became more or less a permanent situation.
And do we know right now how much of our intelligence is outsourced? Are those types of numbers out there?
They aren't out there. I still think I have the only document that laid out. This was 2006 or 7 document from the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was, by the way, an unclassified document. It wasn't a public document, but it wasn't a secret document. That was actually a document that was provided to me by someone who was at a Defense Intelligence agency conference on acquisition, and someone from the NSA gave a presentation, and parts of her presentation were leaked to me, and there was this pie chart that said 70% of the money went to the private sector, 70% of the intelligence budget. And I had been at that time, I'd been looking for such a figure for a few years. And as intelligence budgets, go up over time, if you just say, I think the budget now, if you add everything, it's probably about $100 billion. So I would say, we probably spend about $70 billion a year on intelligence contractors.
So the former head of U.S. National Intelligence, James Clapper, is a former Booz Allen executive.
Right.
Along with the current director of National Intelligence, Joseph McGuire. And that's along with other top CIA and NSA leaders. How typical is this for public officials to go back and forth between public and private?
It's very typical now. But, interestingly, this trend of people leaving high-level defense and intelligence jobs for the private sector, in the defense sector and intelligence sector, it's fairly recent. It's only been, in the last, 40 years or so. And now it's a flood. And now it's not only a revolving door, it's a spinning door, because now people go from government to private sector and then they go back to the government. And there's not enough information really about what kind of, how much they have to divulge about what their dealings with those companies. And there's this whole, gray area there. And I think that's another place where our oversight system is very poor.
So there's a blurred line right now.
Very blurred, yeah.
And of course, we couldn't come all this way without talking about the future of contracting. This is one of the main questions we've been looking at for the entire series. What do these trends mean for the next generation?
So we brought on Dr. Andreas Krieg. He's an assistant professor at the School of Security at King's College London. And recently he co-wrote this book, Surrogate Warfare, The Art of War in the 21st Century. And so he's been grappling with this question for a while as well.
So while in the past, traditionally the state would conventionally rely on the soldier and the armed forces, the military, as a lever of power in war, today the state is engaging in a much more complex, much wider scope of operations that include technological surrogates such as cyber surrogates like bots and trolls online, or any kind of cyber weapon, drones, which are increasingly autonomous, as well as human surrogates of which could be an insurgent group, a terrorist organization, a rebel group, a militia group, or even the private military and security industry, because that is a very big and growing component of that kind of assemblage that we argue the state is building in order to fight the kind of complex, everywhere, forever wars of the 21st century.
And Andreas talked about the consequences of relying on surrogate warfare.
During that delegation process, the state increasingly loses control because surrogates are looking for more autonomy. And, as we introduce automated weapon systems, even these weapon systems will increasingly become more and more autonomous. And we see that also with the private military and security industry. They try to obviously get contracts where they can behave as they see fit without massive government control or state control if the state is declined. And so in this kind of context, the state increasingly loses control, thereby loses control in the long term also over these kind of conflicts. Because the more you delegate, the more you externalize the burden of war. Those who bear the burden of war will eventually own the war and also dictate the outcome of these wars.
Let's not forget about another big issue Andreas is looking at. It's the weaponization of misinformation, which he sees being led by contractors.
I'm looking particularly at the weaponization of narratives and the use of cyber subversion. And I think contractors and surrogates obviously play a very important role in this. Moving forward, I think that any subversive operations, psychological operations or information warfare, which is entirely about trying to manipulate the information environment, is something that will become of increasing importance. And we've seen how the Russians are doing it, and they're doing it very effectively. And I think that the West will no longer just focus on defensive strategic communications, but increasingly also on the use of information, disinformation, misinformation in an effort to subvert particular audiences. And in this kind of behavior requires, again, expertise of companies and contractors. It requires surrogates in the cyberspace, in the social media sphere. And I do think that their contractors will be playing a very important role, but obviously they will not be in uniform, or they will not be carrying arms, and they'll be involved in what most people would call a sub-threshold war. But I think this will be a bigger component moving forward. Again, the future of contracting does not mean the use of physical violence or the employment or the potential employment of kinetic force. I think, as the breadth and the scope of war expands and widens, I think contractors and companies will offer wider and broader services, of which we today might think of being not irrelevant for the military or irrelevant for warfare, but will become increasingly relevant in the future.
So we did recently talk about cyber in one of our recent episodes, but there are still so many ways cyber can influence warfare and how contractors can be used in this space. And one of those ways is something we didn't get to, which is cyber auxiliaries, which the Marine Corps is announcing as a volunteer group of cyber professionals who can train Marines to increase their war readiness. And it's one of the many ways the military is hoping to close this gap in their cyber workforce.
Mark Kansian is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and explains this idea further and why some have come out against this program.
One of the things that's been driving the push towards contractors and the increasing reliance on contractors is the cost and scarcity of military personnel. If you want to have an all-volunteer force, you have to pay a market rate. And as labor becomes more expensive in the economy, you have to pay more and more for military personnel. So as a result, this gap opens between the number of military personnel you can afford and the number that you need. So you've seen that in theater with contractors, but you also see it with special skills like cyber. And my argument with cyber was that the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense need those skills, but they don't need them in the military. With contractors, you have a much more flexible personnel system. You can hire people that are old. You can hire people that are overweight. You can hire people that are in poor health. You can have a diabetic, for example. Much more flexible. You can pay them more. They don't have to subject themselves to military discipline. And you don't get into those problems about changing military standards and changing military expectations. You can keep traditional military discipline for those personnel that need it, but then you can also get these other skills with this more flexible personnel system.
And so what's the argument against that?
I mean, some people, I think, have confused having people in the military with having the capability. In other words, they believe that if you want to have cyber capability, you have to put them in uniform. And I disagree with that. I think there are some people who think that the future of warfare is changing, and therefore the notion of someone sitting at a keyboard as a military person fighting a war is consistent with this new view of conflict. Now, I disagree with that. Department of Defense disagrees with that. Secretary Mattis disagreed with that. But that view has been out there for a long time, I mean, really for about 50 years.
You may remember our interview with Eric Prince, where he talked about his plan to partially privatize the war in Afghanistan. While looking to the future of contracting, Mark says Eric's idea is something the U.S. may still consider.
The United States is in a very tough spot with Afghanistan. That is, the American people and President Trump and many of the Democratic presidential candidates are tired of the war. They want out. On the other hand, the Afghan government is very weak and might collapse if we pull out. And the Taliban sense that they're winning, and they are not compromising at all. So what do you do in that situation? We tried peace negotiations with the Taliban, but it was clear that they were just not going to give us the kind of assurances that we needed. Eric Prince, of course, 2 years ago, comes forward with this proposal to turn a large part of the war over to contractors. Contractors would operate under the Afghan government, but would provide long-term support to the Afghan government. That may be a way out of this conundrum. I doubt if we're ever going to make an announcement out of the White House. Eric Prince has been brought on board to run the Afghan war, but I wouldn't be surprised if, as we cut back forces, that you saw the number of contractors starting to rise to compensate. And that has the great advantage in that they're much less visible. And you can argue about whether that should be or shouldn't be, but it is true. Contractors are much less visible than military, and that might be a way for the U.S. to get the visibility of the war down, but still make a long-term commitment to the Afghan government.
Let's finish with some security contractors who are working in the field today and what they'll tell those who are interested in the work.
And so let's start with Neil Reynolds. He's a South African security contractor, and he wrote the book In the Kill Zone, Surviving as a Private Military Contractor in Iraq. And he's been in the industry since 2001.
If I speak to a military guy today, I would say to him, stay in the military. Contracting work is just what it is, contracting work. And the contracts are getting less and less and less. When the contract finishes, your contract finishes. And that doesn't mean you're going to have another contract. And in 2004, 2005, private security guys were well paid. Today's private security guys are getting half of what the guys in the old days used to get, and even less. The going rate used to be between $10,000 and $15,000. Today, the going rate is between $4,000 and $7,000. And if you've got a $7,000, you're on a pretty good contract. This is in the Middle East. In Africa, there are some contracts that are paying better, but they're also far and few between, and the guys have got to be highly qualified, and the normal military guys are not going to get in. The other thing, the industry has changed in that way. When we first came out, there were no PhD courses and qualifications that one could get. Nowadays, it's changed. If you want to get into the industry, you've got to go and do an official course that is internationally recognized, and they are fairly expensive. The guys with medical have to do a medical course and have all the qualifications. So it's become you've got to have the proper qualifications to get into the industry in the first place, even if you've got a military background. So, yeah, the industry has definitely changed. And, you don't have a pension. You don't have a medical aid. You don't have anything when you leave. The most important thing is look after yourself.
Now we turn back to Matthew Lowe, who runs the blog Feral Jundy. He says he often gets asked for advice from people around the world on how to get started.
I try to be as realistic as I can with them. I'm not going to sugarcoat. It's an interesting industry to get involved with. Unfortunately, I've actually helped guys get jobs in the past who were killed on contracts, and that is absolutely it's a hard thing to think about sometimes. But what's interesting about when you help someone to get in this industry is they're doing something they want to do. They have this drive to want to get into contracting. I mean, I have guys who don't have military backgrounds who want to get into contracting, and I help them. I'll point them in the right direction. Usually for those guys, I'll tell them, you need to go in the military, because most of the companies, they want that 4 years combat arms degree. I call that the arms degree because literally guys with an infantry background with combat time in Iraq or Afghanistan or both are very valuable folks to the companies. And then I've also helped people with absolutely zero background in the military get into contracting. That takes a lot more work, a little bit more luck, but if you're persistent, and that's the key to this work, is persistence is power. That's probably the thing for everything you do in life. You eventually get that contract. But I also say too that we are still heavily involved with combating terrorism all throughout the world. And wherever we're going to be doing that, contractors are going to be needed to support that effort. So contract's not going to go away anytime soon.
Preston McIntyre was in the Air Force for over 5 years and then went into private security contracting. Now Preston is a senior policy advisor with companies in the UAE, and he sees one mistake made over and over again by new contractors.
A lot of former military contractors that come here and other places and other locations, when they get to the location, they kind of keep this mentality of military in a sense, and that transition to be able to go to civilian and looking towards what else is out there is always kind of narrow. And what happens is you see a lot of contractors that hop from one location to the next. They go from contract to contract to contract, and they go around and around and around, and they just end up kind of in this little this hamster wheel. And it's the same thing to me as a rat racer, the same thing to me as being in the military. And a lot of times there's a lot of contractors that they'll get to a location, especially if they're younger. And for instance, if they're here in the UAE, they'll party hard and all these things, and then they'll lose everything, and they'll also lose face. And what they don't understand is that they're not necessarily supported by this safety net that they would have in the military, to where you're always going to have a check, you're always going to have a job, and they end up losing those positions and sometimes causing problems for the contract itself. And they don't know how to separate the two from knowing that the military now is a customer and a client, as opposed to being still in the military. They separate it completely. And that's one of the hardest things for people to do, is the adjustment.
We want to thank everyone who has come on the show to talk about and address some of the important topics facing contracting today.
I'd also like to thank the many who shared their personal life stories. These stories gave you a deeper dive in what their lives were like in the private military contracting field. Those thank yous go out once again to Adam Gonzalez, Barbie Baker and Nicole Woodland, Evan Hafer, Cindy Waldron, Tim Lynch, Colonel Tim Collins, Chris Hoare, Amr Mohammed, Amanda and Tammy Frost, Johan Roth, Kimberly Motley, and Narelle Joyce.
Yes, we want to thank everyone who shared their story. They were all so very personal, but I think they mean a lot, and they'll be important for other people to hear.
Right, and I'd also like to thank our listeners. Their continued support from week to week, input, comments, it was all very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the journey with us, and we hope that we did actually shed some light on some of these things, and that it was valuable to some people.
Don't forget to subscribe, and while you're there, leave us a review. You can also let us know your thoughts at podcast@stripes.com. Also, follow us on Twitter for updates at Stars and Stripes.
Force for Hire's supervising editors are Bob Reed and Terry Leonard. Digital team lead and editor is Michael Darnell.
Thanks for listening.
This is Force for Hire.